as we've been discussing, chapter 7 takes a turn where we go away from simply acting in the world in the best possible way to a real prominent conception of God, such that is even presence in the form of the heat and fire and the taste and water. So it's so available for us in the world. And in that sense, Krishna takes center stage and it becomes a very theological text. It had been before between chapter 1 and 6, but in chapter 7, it truly becomes prominent. And so chapter 8, interestingly enough, does a lot of what chapter 7 did, which is to introduce a theology, right? Where Krishna is the center. But it does so in a using an ancient language that was known in the Upanishads. So it's very Upanishadic language that is used. So in that sense, it's quite technical, Sanskrit-wise. We would have to know this essentially 6 terms that we're going to be diving in that in Sanskrit and what they mean. And in fact, Tukaram Prabhu spent, I would say, at least half of the class driving that point home, how it is that these terms are so important to know and be familiar with them, especially within the context of the culture and how they are used, because then they really come out. And I believe what we're going to be doing here today is attempting to take these terms, which are rather technical, and make them very digestible for someone who may not be so familiar with Sanskrit or ancient Hindu culture, and still give all the powerful meaning and lessons and teachings behind it. So again, in terms of context, we're talking about a theology, and we're going to do so with ancient language now. And that's essentially the end of chapter 7. Before go there, what are your thoughts, Kim?
Yeah, I loved class, by the way, and just learning about the nuances of what the words mean in Sanskrit and how sometimes there isn't even an equivalent that you can come up with in English. You can use a lot of words to try to get to the equivalent, but knowing the language and getting into Sanskrit really appeals to the technical side of me. So there's a lot of wealth of knowledge in there.
Right. And just a side note, not necessarily spiritual, but well, I guess spiritual too. As we are discussing these points about these terminologies and so on and what they mean, Tukaram made an interesting point that we benefit tremendously by reading many different books, etc., which will cause our vocabulary to expand. And I'm a huge fan of this, I want to say theory, but I think it's more of a verified theory than just a theory, because I really enjoy, reading books, expanding vocabulary, etc. But then he made this point that we actually think in language. Like when we are thinking with words. And one extra benefit of, reading books, spiritual books, or even material books that are pious, let's say, it gives you many benefits. And one of them is your ability to have deeper thoughts, more powerful thoughts, deeper thoughts, because you're going to have a wider range of ways in which your thoughts can go in depth in particular topics. So I thought it was a very interesting point that he made, just like, as he's giving class, just he took about 10 seconds to make that point. And those are the things that I really appreciate about our class. We can expand on each one of these topics, and there's like a lot of knowledge over there. So I just want to touch on that because, yeah, those are Sanskrit terms, and someone who may not be familiar with Sanskrit may be asking themselves, well, what's the point? Like, are we here to learn spirituality or another language? Well, there is a benefit in learning this language because it will give you these terms, which, like you mentioned, Kim, really don't have any counterpart in English. and therefore you would forever be limited in your ability to think in terms of this spirituality that the Bhagavad Gita brings about. So by knowing these terms and owning them, you can start connecting your thoughts to one another, and thus allowing you to have a deeper, bigger spiritual realization. So anything else, Kim, before we move on?
No, I really like that you called out that point. That's a really good point about going deeper into our spirituality, even. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Sanskrit is a tremendous language for. I always heard, and when I first started my journey in Krishna consciousness, that Sanskrit was such a powerful language to study if you want to get in depth into your spiritual understanding. And I kind of just left it at that. And I spent at least 5 years not really caring about the Sanskrit aspect of our scriptures. But for the past few years of being very interested in it, and I'm having these realizations, like knowing the Sanskrit and these terms and how they are used, it just gives you a different perspective of the world and the spiritual philosophy, which would otherwise be difficult to grasp. But now you can think about them with a much bigger context, so it's it's a very powerful exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so the very last text of chapter 7 is text 30. And I will read that text now. Those in full consciousness of me, who know me, the Supreme Lord, to be the governing principle of the material manifestation, of the demigods, of all the methods of sacrifice, can understand and know me, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, even at the time of death. And so this text is a perfect segue into chapter 8, because chapter 8, which I will read now, the very text of it, the very first text of it, it reads, Arjuna said, and again, Arjuna said something to Krishna, and Krishna's last words was the verse that I just read, 30, to which Arjuna responds, O my Lord, O Supreme Person, what is Brahman? What is the self? What are fruitive activities? What is this material manifestation? What are the demigods? Please explain this to me. Who is now that's text 2. Who is the Lord of sacrifice, and how does he live in the body? How can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? So these two texts, which are essentially questions by Arjuna to Krishna, really is Arjuna's reactions to Krishna's last text on chapter 7. And so Krishna will now spend the entire chapter 8 answering these questions by Arjuna. So that's essentially what chapter 8 will be. It will be the answers to these questions that Arjuna asked in these two texts based upon the last text of chapter 7. And so, Klim, is that clear? You want to add anything to this?
No, that's a nice segue, pointing out the importance of the last verse of chapter 7. So,
right. All right. So now let's dive into it a little bit more. So the first text of chapter 8, Arjuna inquired, "O my Lord, O Supreme Person, what is Brahman?" So Brahman is one of the terms that we're going to be focusing on. So what is Brahman? That's one. What is the self? That's another one. That's 2. What are fruitive activities? That's 3. What is this material manifestation? That's 4. What are the demigods? That's 5. Please explain these to me. Now, there are 6. So then text 2, Arjuna continues and says, who is the Lord of sacrifice? And that's 6. So those are the 6 terms. And who is the Lord of sacrifice? And how does it live in the body? And how can those engage in devotional service? know you at the time of death. All right, so now I'm gonna repeat all those terms alone, so because that's where we're gonna spend a lot of our time here now, defining these terms. So uh, Brahman, self, fruitive activities, material manifestation, demigods, and Lord of Sacrifice. Essentially, Arjuna asked, what are these things? And Krishna spends chapter 8 answering these questions, what these things are. Now, earlier I mentioned that similar to chapter 7, chapter 8 also introduces or reintroduces a theology. And this is how that is done. So this requires a little bit unpacking. So I'll touch on that right now. Every time we have a theology means a philosophy where God is prominent, where God is in the middle of it, right? So philosophy doesn't necessarily include God, but a theology necessarily includes God. So when we're talking about a theology that includes God, there are some components that must be there in order to be considered a theology or full theology. And those concepts are, okay, what is God, first of all? Then who are we? Because we are a big part of everything that's going on, right? Our own awareness of ourselves. And then the world in which we find ourselves, like what is this? Like the world or the universe, let's say. And so any theology that is complete or worthwhile studying must necessarily explain these three things: God, us, and the world, because those are very three prominent things, right? Now, it is not sufficient to only explain those things in theological circles. Theologians, that's what they're discussing. We also have to explain the relationship between these three terms. So in other words, how do we relate to God? How does God relate to the world? And how do we relate to the world? So the relationship of all three of these things. And so that's a very strong theological structure. And any religion really has defined and must define these things, because those are the questions that will come up. And so again, chapter 8 reintroduces a theology, but not only now talking about earth, water, air in terms of being everything, but now the material nature is how Arjuna asks. So he puts everything in one, but like everything that is material, just put it in the bucket and saying like, what are those things, right? And by Krishna answering this question, this is how chapter 8 is more of a theological chapter, as chapter 7 was. Okay, so now let's start defining these terms. So question number one, like what is Brahman? And Brahman is, the word Brahman is used in so many different ways. But the particular way in which we are going to use now is Brahman, it means spirit. Okay, so if you like, that which is not material, which is spiritual. And it has certain attributes. One of the attributes of Brahman, as it is written in the text, is that it's undecaying, which means eternal, right? It's not decaying, it's not changing, it's always the same, and therefore is eternal. So that is a big contrast in relationship to things that are material, because due to entropy, we know everything which is material decays and ends. And that's a big division between spiritual and material. So Brahman, being in spiritual, is that which is undecaying, is unchanging, and therefore is eternal and always the same. So that's Brahman. And therefore, when we think about the soul, guess what? That's who we are. The soul is also spiritual, and the soul, not the body, but us, our true self, is spiritual and therefore eternal. and unchanging. Did you have any comments on that, Kim?
No, I was just thinking, so in this context, Brahman would be referring to the soul, our
Yes.
soul, individual soul.
Yes. Again, Brahman refers to the soul, the individual soul, meaning us. Brahman can also refer to God, more of an impersonal God, but it can also refer to God. It has many different meanings, but the reason why we're saying here, Brahman means us, like spirit, spiritual things, right? Is because there are 6 things that we're defining, and one of which Krishna clearly says, that's me. And it's not Brahman. So therefore, Brahman is not God. It's not referring to God here in this particular passage of the Gita. Because if God, if we were using Brahman to refer to God, then I'm going to do a spoiler here. Adi yagya, which is how Krishna says, that's who I am, then you wouldn't be God, right? Because Krishna is already saying, I am Adi yagya. So that is God. And therefore, Brahman would have to be us, the individual souls. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so that is Brahman. Then there is self. So self here is Adi Atma. So the Adi Atma, it has also its attributes, right? So swabhav. So meaning our nature. So this will require a little bit of thinking, but we can certainly do it because we've been talking about these things and we're just putting it all together right now. The soul is a unit of spirit. Its defining attribute is consciousness. So when the soul is in the body is animated. We are walking around, we are talking, we are interacting with people. And all that is happening through consciousness, right? We are individual units of consciousness. So not only we are spiritual, but the defining attributes of us being spirit soul is that we have consciousness. So Adhyatma here just then refers to spirit again, but in this unit that is us with consciousness. That is Adhyatma. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so that is Adhyatma. So that's Krishna's answers to what is the self. Then what are fruitive activities? So that is karma. That's what we mean by karma. Now, karma is really misunderstood in the West. And that's a problem. Again, part of knowing the Sanskrit and really expanding our vocabulary to really be able to think in depth of these topics, it's worthwhile to really introduce karma the way the Upanishads did. That allows us to really get a much bigger picture of what that is. In the West, we are thinking karma is just reactions. Let's say, for example, I win the lottery. Oh, that was his good karma. Or I get cancer. Oh, that was my bad karma. So that's the reaction. Well, let's say that's like the shallowest level of understanding karma. If you go one level deeper, then we will see that karma in the original ancient Sanskrit also means actions, not just reactions, but also your actions, things that you are doing, your behavior, how you're behaving in the world. But if you go even deeper, karma also means the contents of your mind. So your mentality, let's say, the combination of all of your desires, things you like and things you dislike, those, let's say, your mental contents, your mental activity. That's also known as karma. Or why? Well, because you cannot act without a preceding thought. So you always think about something and then you act on that something, and hopefully you have good judgment in terms of what are the thoughts that you should act upon and those that you shouldn't, because I think all of us have had embarrassing thoughts in our minds at many different points in our lives. And we thank goodness that others cannot read our mind. So a big part of our intelligence is to say, okay, this is just a thought. I don't have to act on it. Let me control myself, right? But then again, karma is therefore our thoughts, the contents of our mind, and our actions and our reactions. So karma, okay, so that's karma. All right. I'm thinking about how to put all this together in a logical way. So we will come back to karma, because there's one important aspect of karma as it is being described by Krishna in this particular text, but it will have a bigger context after we define other terms. So we'll move on and we'll come back to karma for one more point. So then the next question was, what are fruitive activities? Okay, that's karma. And then what is this material manifestation? There's another interesting aspect about ancient Hindu culture, let's say, which is the personification of essentially all things. For example, gravity. Gravity is a law of nature. And in the West, we know it as such. It's just a law of nature. And as such, it's quite impersonal. But in ancient Hindu culture, there is a personification of all these concepts. So gravity wouldn't be just this impersonal law of nature that causes you to fall down if you don't watch how you're walking properly, but is actually, let's say, a demigod. There's a personality. That is a demigod is nothing but a soul like you and I, who has had a spiritual, who has made a lot of spiritual progress, who became, let's say, bigger and better, not in the material sense, but in the spiritual sense. A highly elevated soul then occupies the position of a demigod in the universe. So these are beings that are much, much higher than we are, right? So then demigods are actually, or let's say one demigod is actually a demigod of gravity. So that particular personality, that highly elevated soul, has a duty, a universal duty given to that soul by Krishna, which is to manage gravity. And therefore, there is a personification of all these concepts. For example, the sun, the moon, they are all known as their particular deity, their particular, not deity, but demigod, I should have said. And so when Arjuna asked, what is this material manifestation, which the term then is Adi Daiva that we are describing here now, we can say it is the demigods, the Adi Daiva are the demigods. But if we go a level towards impersonalism or towards more like in terms of the universe, then it becomes all the laws of nature, gravity, entropy, etc. Fundamental principles of reality, such as numbers, etc. These are all material nature, the universe in which we find ourselves, right? Again, going back to being part of a theology, we would have to define these things. Okay, then let me go back here. And then what is the material manifestation and what are the demigods? So the material manifestation and the demigods are in one sense put together here by taking this impersonal way of looking at the material manifestation, but then making it personified by assigning demigods as the controllers of these particular aspects of material nature. And then who is the Lord of sacrifice? And that is the Lord of sacrifice, that is Adi Yagya. So yagya is something that we have already spoken in the past. Yagya means sacrifice. And Adi Yagya here is therefore the Lord of sacrifice. And Krishna says, I am Adi Yagya, the Lord of sacrifice, who is also sitting in your heart. So now let's start connecting these things a little bit more. So we are the Adi, we are Brahman because we are spiritual. So in that sense, we are Brahman. But then we have Adi Atma, which is our nature, consciousness, let's say. And that consciousness possesses free will. And so through free will, we can either choose to be engaged in the world, or we can choose to be engaged in, let's say, spiritual activities, right? So now, Adhyatma, therefore, consciousness has this possibility. If we are so attentive to the world, and our karma, therefore, which are our mental states, the thoughts that we have in our mind, and the actions that we perform, if they are all materially focused, then we get Adi Bhuta. So this is actually, I must apologize, I misspoke earlier. Adi Bhuta is actually material manifestation. And Adidaiva is really the laws of the universe, or guided by personal demigods, okay? So Adibhuta is a term that I didn't introduce. Again, I apologize, I misspoke earlier. Adibhuta is really the material manifestation, okay? So the bodies that we have, the material bodies that we have, that's Adibhuta, okay? The attributes of material nature, such as earth, water, fire, air, etc., that's also Adibhuta, right? So those are the material stuff that makes up the world. So that is Adibhuta. So back to what I was going towards right now, which is to create a story about all of this, which is something that Tukaram did in class, which I really appreciated, because we're talking about these terms in Sanskrit and their definitions. And it can be a little bit abstract or difficult to extrapolate a meaning that is really powerful. And I would try to elaborate on a story right now that combines all of this and gives us a really good teaching. So Brahman, us, spirit, right? The soul. We have Adi Atma, which is our nature, which is consciousness, because spiritual units of who we are spiritual units. We have consciousness. That's an attribute of us, of ours. With that consciousness, we can choose to turn it towards God or turn it towards the material world. If we turn it towards the material world, that is karma. That is the contents of our mind, our actions in the material world. And by engaging our consciousness in this material manner, we get Adibhuta, which is our material body, which is nothing but the same material stuff that makes up the entire universe, like the dirt of the earth and fire, air, etc. So then by karma, us Brahman, by using our Adi Atma, which is our nature, in a karmic way, we get Adi Bhuta, which is the material body we have. When we are embodied, because we now have this body, which is Adi Bhuta, we are now controlled by Adi Daiva, which are the demigods controlling the laws of material nature, such as gravity, entropy, etc. So if you are in the body, you're certainly controlled by gravity and all the other physical laws, and that is Adidaiva. But we have free will, Brahman, right? And the Adhyatma, which is consciousness, uses that free will to either act in a karmic way, or we can act in a bhakti way, which is to turn towards God. which is adi yagya. So the story here is that it clearly puts this possibility in our hands. And it also shows how Krishna is so loving towards us. What is the possibility? The possibility to get out of the world, because we are here acting in this karmic way and constantly creating another body for ourselves. In Sanskrit, this is called samsara, the cycle of birth and death. If you want to break away from that, you can, because you, Brahman, uh, through your consciousness, the atma, you can choose to turn that into bhakti, meaning you're thinking and acting for Krishna rather than thinking and acting for material purposes, which is karma. And that is going to constantly give you another and another and another that we now call adibhuta, which is the body, the material body. So, oh yes, and then also as adi yagya, which is Krishna saying, that's who I am, sitting in your heart. This is a very important point. Krishna is sitting in our hearts, which means he's never really too far away from us. It is truly only our karma, which now we can understand it from a much deeper way. Karma, it's not just our reactions. It's not just my karma that I got a body. I'm thinking about engaging in activities that will necessitate a material body in order for me to be able to experience, such as I want more money, or I want more sexual partners, or I want more honor, I want more glory for me to experience. If that's the contents of your mind, if that's your karma, then that's certainly what you're going to get. But Krishna is never too away from us. Krishna says, I am sitting in your heart. Me, Adi Yagya, as the Lord of sacrifice, I am sitting in your heart, which means Krishna is never too far away. And because we have free will, we can turn towards Krishna. And that is the redemption of the soul, not just the fall of the soul, but also the redemption. Because the fall of the soul, who is Brahman, who has Adhyatma, was to engage in karma, and therefore getting a body and now being controlled by Adidaiva, which are the demigods performing all the laws of the universe. So that's how we fell down from the spiritual existence that we once had. But we can go back because Krishna is in our hearts. He's witnessing our true desire, the true contents of our mind, and therefore our actions in the world. And we can liberate ourselves again by engaging in bhakti. And again, attaining Adi Yagya, God, because he's in our heart. He never left us. He's our best friend. He allows us to come over here and act out our karma, but he never abandoned us. He's always close to us. He's in our hearts. And so I thought that defining these terms is a little bit technical. It requires Sanskrit, but if we take away the technicality and the theological aspect of it, but think about these terms in this story, that is very powerful, because again, it accounts for why are we here, like the big questions in life. Why are we here? Where do we come from? What is this world? Is there life after death? And where do I go from here? So just defining these 6 terms in a more comprehensive way can explain each and all of these questions, which are highly theological questions as well. So I thought that this story, learning these terms and keeping them in perspective through the lenses of this particular story, it was very, very powerful. What are your thoughts on all of this, Kim?
Yeah, as you were talking about karma, the thought crossed my mind, and I just wanted to clarify to make sure I understand this. So with our nature, if we turn towards the material world, we're engaged in this cycle of karma. And that's implying that if we then choose to turn towards God, we will be detaching ourselves more from the karmic process. Like when you describe that, are you saying that when we turn towards God, getting away from karma is going to the spiritual world. I don't know if I'm asking that correctly or clearly.
Try again.
Because let's say you come into this world, you're very attached to the material world, you're engaged in all these cycles of karma and karmic reactions, and then in this same physical lifetime, you turn towards God, and now you're no longer as embroiled in this karmic give and take, so to speak. And so then you can establish that connection with God in this lifetime where karma becomes less of a factor. Is that fair to say?
So yes, it is fair to say that. I don't know if I'm going to necessarily add to what you said, but I will attempt to explain in this way. Activities in terms of we have a desire, we have, let's say, our true mind, our spiritual mind, and therefore we're going to act in a particular way. That never ends because we are eternal and we are always engaged in activities. However, the nature of our mind, the nature of the contents of our mind and the nature of our actions will change because they will no longer be worldly, meaning material, but they will be focusing on Krishna, and that will take us back to the spiritual world. So in that sense, if you look at karma as thoughts in our minds, which leads to actions, and those actions will have a reaction. If you look at karma as this three parts thing, then in that sense, no, it won't end because we're always going to be doing that. But we can do that spiritually, and that will take us to the spiritual world, or we can do that materially, and that is going to keep us stuck here in the material world. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that clarifies it a lot. When you were speaking, I was thinking, Tukram describes it as a triangle with all the three
Right.
elements. And as you were speaking, I was really seeing how there are different versions of our connections to the world. You can be
Right.
very materially oriented or more spiritually oriented. And so, and what you just said, clarifying karma as being, okay, what kind of karma are we talking about? What kind of reactions and actions are we talking about? That clarifies it a lot.
In fact, I'm glad you bring that up. In fact, we in the previous 6 chapters or 7 chapters, we have commented on, well, Krishna has commented on spiritualists that are trying to end their karma by doing nothing. Like, let's say, going to a cave and just being there, not engaging in the material world. So again, they're acting with this knowledge in mind that if I have thoughts about the material world and I engage in the material world, then I'm going to get a body. So there are a way of escaping this cycle of birth and death in the material world and going to the spiritual world. Is like, well, I'm going to end all my karma, meaning I'm just going to sit in this cave. I'm not going to engage in the material world. I'm not going to act in the material world. And therefore, I'm no longer going to get a body. And therefore, I'll be liberated at the time of death, which Krishna is not really fond of, because that would imply, yes, Arjuna, get out of the battlefield and go to the cave and just end your karma doing that. Krishna says, no, there's a much better way for you to just end your karma, your material karma, which gets very nuanced. Krishna says, those who sees action in inaction and inaction in action actually sees things as they are, which is like really paradoxical, right? But if we were to deconstruct that, what it means is I see in action, meaning I can be sitting in a cave and I can like not be acting in the world, but I am still in my mind, I'm still attached. I have material desires. I don't really have a high concept of God. So even though I am inactive, as it seems in the surface, sitting in a cave, there are still actions in the sense that you're still not going to get liberated and you're going to come back with another body. So that is us seeing action in inaction. But then, which is what really Krishna is proposing we do, is in action, which is what Arjuna did. Arjuna engaged in actions in the battlefield, which is like the most actionable of all actions, right? When you are in a battlefield, you are certainly acting. But what does Krishna says? But if you're doing it with a spiritual goal, then there is inaction in those actions, in the sense that you're not really performing any karma. And you're going to give rid of all your karma because all your actions are spiritual, for a spiritual purpose. And therefore, they are in action in the sense that you don't act in the world. You are in the world, but you're not of it. You are acting for spiritual purposes. So there's inaction. There's material inaction in that spiritual action. Does that follow?
Yeah, yeah.
So in that sense, karma, which is so linked to acting, right, can be used to develop adibhuta, which are the stuff of the material world, which is our body is made out of that, right, matter. Or it can be engaged in bhakti, which then those thoughts and actions will be aimed towards Krishna. And therefore, the reaction of that at the time of death will be Krishna. You go back to Krishna.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really an intricate system. And I really like Tukaram's triangle format because everything's so connected. Like
Yes.
even though we are, say, in this lifetime not seeking a relationship with God, we're still connected to God because God controls the world. The demigods are controlling our material experiences to some degree, and the type of actions, the karmic paths that we're on, we're still so intricately tied to God, whether or not we acknowledge or seek a relationship with Him or not.
Yes. And again, in terms of presenting a complete theology, not only we are defining God, us, and the world, which is yagya. If you think about the triangle that Tukaram talks about, yagya would be at the top of the triangle, that's God. Then let's say at the bottom left of the triangle would be Brahman, that's us. And then the bottom right of the triangle would be adibhuta, which is the world. So God, us, and the world. So any serious theology has to define these terms in a very comprehensive way, actually. So God, us, and the world. Then is the relationship between these three things. Because otherwise, if God created the world, but he has no relationship to the world, that's a different type of God than the God we're studying. That would be more of a God that is not interested in us, not the triple O God that we conceive of, all powerful, all good, and all loving. Because if he creates the world because he's all powerful and all knowledgeable, all powerful, and all good, right? He's all knowledgeable, so he has the knowledge to create the world. Then he's all powerful, he has the power to create the world. But then if he doesn't have any more relationship with the world, meaning he created the world and then went on to experience bigger and better things, then we are here alone. We are here kind of like stuck. Then he would not be all good, no? Because he wouldn't have the care for us. So it is important to not only define God, us, and the world, but the relationship between these three. And this is captured here because our relationship to the world is karma. That's how we get adibhuta, right? The world. Our relationship to God is bhakti. So adi atma is allows us to have a relationship to the world or God. But if it's bhakti, then it's our relationship to God. But God's relationship to the world is adidaiva. So those are the demigods. And there's a very interesting point here, which is really captured in the original Greek translation of the Bible. In the beginning, there was logic. I'm playing with translations here, but many Bibles it starts like that. In the beginning, there was logic. Logos is the word for logic. Theos is a derivative of that, meaning logic. Okay, so in the beginning, in the Bible, it is said, in the beginning, there was logic. Well, what is the point of that? It is God relating to the world. And Tukaram made these points in class also, that ancient Greek philosophers and theologians would look at that precisely as such, as that when you see logic in the world, that is God revealing a tiny small aspect of himself to us right here in the world. In fact, uh, in you beauty, that is God showing himself to us in the world. And so the way that God relates to the world is through demigods that are controlling the universal affairs of the world. And so that is another way to understand this triangle and the relationship between everything to everything, really. Does that make sense, Kim?
Yeah, and it really ties into the theme in the last few episodes of everything being related to God
Mm-hmm.
and how God gives us our desire for demigods. This can more easily highlight how that happens in the process. It's just so intricately designed and functioning, and it's quite amazing. And I
Yes,
like how you keep emphasizing how any bona fide spiritual tradition needs to be able to answer these three things. And that's where some of them fail. Like they might be strong on the world part or the soul part, but then they falter a little bit in how God relates to the world or how God relates to the soul. And so a good theology, yeah, needs to explain not only the three parts, but how they relate to each other in a logical way.
correct. Now, so these questions that Arjuna asked was text 1 and 2. Then I've been answering them myself, which is a terrible thing since Krishna did it himself. So I'm going to read text 3, which is Krishna's answers, actually. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, the indestructible, transcendental living entity is called Brahman. So indestructible, that's what I mean. It's like non-decaying, never changing, always the same. Brahman is the living entity. And his eternal nature is called atma. So his eternal nature means consciousness. So the indestructible, transcendental living entity is called Brahman. That is us. And his eternal nature is atma. So our eternal nature is consciousness itself, that which all of science has no clue about, has never been able to detect, has never been able to study in an empirical way, has never been able to measure, has never been able to see, taste, touch, etc. That is consciousness. That is the nature of the transcendental living entity called Brahman, consciousness, which is called Adhyatma, the self. Action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entities called karma or fruitive activities. So again, here we're going to action, so which is how karma is most known in the West. So it's perhaps the best way to translate that. So actions pertaining to the development of the material body is called fruitive activity. It's called karma or fruitive activities. Now, text 4. All best of the embodied beings, this is Krishna talking to Arjuna, the physical nature, which is constantly changing, is called adibhuta, the material manifestation. Again, if we think about the cosmos, the entire universe, all the, some atheist scientists will say that we're nothing but stardust, that everything that exists in the universe is a consequence of a star, essentially, that exists in the universe out there somewhere, blowing. And then after that, like our sun is a star. And even though it's inconceivable to us how long the sun has existed in terms of its beginning and its end, scientists that preoccupy themselves with such studies conclude that, yeah, the sun is going to last for this much time and then it's going to blow up, explode, just like every other star has in our universe. And then when such stars comes to an end and they blow up, They call it the, I think, don't hold me for this, but I believe that's the supernova events. That's what they call it. I don't know. But stars blow up and then they become dust. So atheistic scientists will say that me and you and everything else there is nothing but star dust, which really gets this sense of matter, right? This material stuff that makes up the entire universe, including me and you, and all the galaxies and all the stars is just stars dust. So this is matter, like fire, air, wood, water, etc. That is bhuta, right? Transcendental living entities is called Brahman, and is, oh, actually, sorry, I started reading from the wrong. Yeah. All best of the embodied beings, the physical nature, which is constantly changing, is called bhuta. Yes, physical nature, constantly changing. The stars are being born and the stars are blowing and they give up dust, and that dust is what creates planets and creates our material body, and it's constantly changing in the cycle of a year or a lifetime, but it's constantly changing, and that is bhuta, the material manifestation. The universal form of the Lord. Now, continuing with text 4, the universal form of the Lord, which includes all the demigods, like those of the sun and the moon, is called Adidaiva. So we call it the universal form of the Lord. That's what I meant earlier by personifying this rather impersonal and abstract laws of the universe, such as gravity and etc. We look at that as Krishna's universal form, and which includes all the demigods. The universal form of the Lord, which includes all the demigods, is called Adidaiva. And I, the Supreme Lord, represented as the super soul in the heart of every embodied being, am called Yagya, the Lord of sacrifice. And then text 5, and whoever at the end of his life quits his body, remembering me alone, at once attains my nature. Of this, there is no doubt. Then text 6, whatever states of being one remembers when he quits his body, that states he will attain without fail. So I think these two texts are very, very interesting, text 5 and 6. So the idea that, and whoever at the end of life quits his body, remembering me alone, at once will attain my nature. Let's think of Krishna as the highest possible conceivable goal, much more difficult than getting into Harvard or Yale or Princeton, much more difficult than becoming the president of the United States, even though the bar for that criteria has been lowered tremendously in the past 4 years. But let's say it is still quite of an accomplishment if you become the president of the United States. So let's say that all of these goals are extremely inferior to attaining Krishna. If Krishna is God, if our proposition is true that Krishna is God, then to attain unalloyed love for Krishna would be a much higher goal than any of these things. So Krishna says a very interesting, Krishna states a very interesting fact here. He says, at the end of life, if you quit your body remembering me alone, you attain me. So really what you have to do to attain this almost unfathomable goal of attaining Krishna is to simply remember him, and then you're going to attain that nature. And then he complements that text by saying, the other text 6, right? Whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body. Now he's like, whatever, not just me. First, in text 5, he says, if you kill your body remembering me, you attain me. And again, that's a really high goal. Now in 6, he says, hey, whatever state of mind you have when you keep your body, you're going to attain that state. Now there's so much in here, because it implies what a lot of neo-spiritualist paths are talking about. Oh, the power of your mind. If you focus on something, you attain that something. Whatever you think about, that you become. It's such a neo-spiritualist concept. The Secret, the movie that came out not too long ago called The Secret. The whole secret is that you think about something very passionately to the point that your thoughts and your feelings are all connected and they're very focused. And by thinking and feeling that way, the universe is the language that they use, right? The universe will arrange itself and provide you with that thing that you're so desiring. That's of like a very neo-spiritualist type of thought. But guess what? It is true because here's Krishna saying that. Bhagavad Gita was spoken 5,000 years ago. That's 3,000 years before Christ. And Krishna says, when he's speaking that to Arjuna, he says, I spoke that to the sun god. And Arjuna says, well, wait a minute. The sun god was born millions of years before you. How could you taught him that? So my point for bringing this up is that this is ancient wisdom. This is very, very ancient spiritual truth that God himself is speaking for our benefits. And obviously, if we don't misguide or misuse this knowledge and this information, we are going to develop our minds and our thoughts and our feelings towards love of Krishna, because then that is what we attain. Because Krishna does leave the door open here. He says, whatever state of being you remember when you quit your body, that state you will attain. So if your karma, with our newly defined conception of karma, if your karma, meaning the contents of your minds, your thoughts, and your actions in the world as well, is such that you're going to require another body to experience, you're going to come back here. Whatever states you have, that you're going to attain. And that really highlights the power of our mind, the power of our thoughts, and the power of our actions, because simply by aligning those, we can attain Krishna, the highest of the goals, or we can truly misuse it and attain whatever else it is that we want, even if it is a pig's body, because we are so uncontrolled in our eating habits, then become a pig. Or if you are very proud about your intellect, then become a professor at an Ivy League school your next lifetime. So whatever it is that you have is what you're going to attain. And Krishna says throughout the Gita, always think of me, offer all your actions for me, because at the end of your incarnation, when death comes, that is going to be your karma. That's going to be what you're thinking about. That's going to be the way you're acting. And Krishna will, without a doubt, is what he said, make sure that you go back to him if he is the center of the contents of your mind. Otherwise, you continue to live birth and death, fulfilling your material desires in material worlds. What are your thoughts, Kim?
Yeah, I found it, when I first read this, I found it very interesting about the idea of how important it is at the time that you quit your body. And the fact that even Krishna calls it out specifically, mentioning that what you're remembering when you quit your body. He's not talking here about, oh, how you lived your life and what you did for service and all that. He's talking about the moment that you quit your body. And so I feel there's a lot of weight that is given to this process, and that offers a lot of hope. It offers a little bit of fear, like, oh, what if I'm distractedly thinking about the wrong thing at the time of death? But knowing that God is all loving, I don't worry about that too much anymore. So yeah, it's kind of unbelievable that it is possible to, like you said, attain something that is so difficult to attain. But that once again, Krishna is showing full confidence in us, that he's helping us, and that it's possible.
Right. I'm going to read text 7. Did we cover 7 in class?
I don't remember.
Let me read text 7, and because you brought up a good point. So point was that if whatever it is that we're thinking at the time of death, that's what we're going to attain, then that's a process which is very powerful, and which does live, you said, a little bit of fear, right? Like, what if I think of the wrong thing? So I'm going to address that a little bit, and I will start by reading text 7. Therefore, Arjuna, you should always think of me in the form of Krishna, and at the same time carry out your prescribed duty of fighting. With your activities dedicated to me and your mind and intelligence fixed on me, you will attain me without doubt. So I see how all three texts here are connected. So whoever at the time of death quits his body, remember me, you're going to attain me. Whatever it is that you think about when you quit your body, whatever you remember when you quit your body, you're going to attain. But then Krishna says, you're going to attain without a doubt, without fail. But then Krishna says, well, then always think of me, because that implies is a unstated premise, right? That implies that, well, if you always think of me and you dedicate your activities in mind and intelligence to me, Krishna said, then you attain me without doubt. That leaves me with two things, that either A, if you happen to be the best of devotees all your life, and you are in an airplane, and the airplane starts picking up a bunch of turbulences, and like, what are you going to think about, right? Like, a lot of people would think about, oh my gosh, the airplane is going to crash and you're going to all die. Are you truly going to be able to think about Krishna in that crucial moment? And furthermore, is that what it's all about? I spent my entire life so that I can think of Krishna at the very moment before I die. And if I'm in an airplane, too bad. I just thought about the airplane crashing, and then my entire life was in vain. That doesn't seem to follow because of what you said. Krishna is all loving. And even if that was the case, that you happen to be in an airplane and you thought about, oh my gosh, we're going down with the plane, and then boom, you die, and that was your last thought, you're not going to come back as an airplane pilot, because Krishna is all loving. Krishna is going to say, well, yeah, he did everything he needed to do in his life, and he has the contents of their mind is me. I'm the center. So let's say there's 99% Krishna, and then the 0.01 thought that, oh, I might die in this airplane. And then when I do die, are we going to focus on the 0.01%, that thought I'm going to die in this airplane? Or are we going to, or is the system that Krishna created really concerned about the other 99.9% contents of your mind and consciousness and intelligence, which is him, right? So it doesn't seem, I see a lot of people do have that question, but it doesn't seem very logical that that would be the case, that the 0.01% of that one mere thought I had in a split second would overwrite my entire life and the entire contents of my consciousness, right? So, yeah, and
yeah, that's a really good point. It's kind of like, I think the end of life is an indication of where you are based on what you just said, what you have gravitated towards, what you're dedicating your life to, what you're focused on. Kind of like what you know at the end of a PhD program is what you'll be graded on. Like, you spent so many years building up to that point, and then the end of your life is kind of a good test of where you really are. Like, Krishna knows what's in our hearts. So
I like that analogy. Let me run with it. So let's say you went to Harvard and you got a PhD, how long ever it would take you to do that. And then you're walking through your graduation. And at that moment that the dean of your college is going to hand you your certification, let's say that is that, right? Or the conclusion. And the moment you are about to grab that, you look in the sky and you see a bird flying through, and you say, oh, what is that bird? And then you're like, lost your entire merit of your Harvard PhD because you got distracted right before you caught on to your certification. That doesn't seem to make sense. You still put in all that time, and you're still a PhD, you know? So
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, and also just like text 7, how Krishna says, therefore, Arjuna, always think of me in the form of Krishna, and at the same time carry your prescribed duty of fighting. So he's not asking Arjuna to be inactive. Krishna is going to be active. I mean, Arjuna is going to be active, he's going to be fighting. But that is what I mentioned earlier. There is inaction in this action, meaning inaction, karmic, material karmic action is not here, because Krishna is saying, think of me while you carry out your duty. That action has no reaction, and therefore is inaction, the true inaction, not the inaction of prematurely renunciating the world, but still sitting there with a bunch of material desires on your mind. That is action, even though you seem to be inactive. But then always think of me. You can only always think of something if you truly love or you truly hate that thing. If you don't truly intensely love or truly intensely hate something, you cannot think about that something always. It's not possible. But Krishna says is always think of me. And if you're always thinking of Krishna, then what are your actions going to be? Like we described karma earlier, right? Karma meaning the contents of your minds, your thoughts, then your actions, and then your reactions. If you always think of Krishna because you love him, you're always going to act for him. So always think of me in the form of Krishna, which implies that God has a form, which makes him a person. He's not formless in person, he's a personal form. And at the same time, carry out your prescribed duty, which is essentially the sum of the entire first third of the Gita, chapters 1 through 6, is summarized in here. Always think of me and carry out your duty. Like, do your duty, don't be attached to the results because you're always thinking of me.
Yeah, and I really love text 7, the end, with your activities dedicated to me, fixed on me, you will attain me without doubt. Once again, this sentiment is mentioned a few times throughout the Gita, where don't worry about it, you will attain me without doubt. Like Krishna has no doubt in us.
Do the right thing. Think of me. Develop your love for me. Think about the big picture. Have your mind fixed on me. And in that way, you love him, and he's not going to leave you alone. And therefore, you're going to attain him without doubt. Now, this will be the last point I'll make today. When I say to you, Kim, oh yeah, next weekend, let's go hang out. Let's go to the beach together. Oh yeah, I'm going to be there without doubt. If it rains, I'm sorry, I may not be there, Kim. What do I call it? A rain check, right? I'll give you a rain check. Or if something else comes up, like some emergency comes up in my work and I have to work on the weekend, I'm also going to not be there, right? That's me. There's a difference when God says that this is going to happen without a doubt. When God says this, it is not for us to take lightly. It is not like we are saying this. When God says it, it is for sure. It is an absolute truth. And that's what's going to happen. So I want to really make this distinction because it is effort. It does take effort to chant your rounds every day. It takes at least an hour and 45 minutes if you're doing it properly. And I mean, just think about that alone, right? An hour and 45, like take 2 hours out of your day. How are you still going to arrange everything and manage everything else that you do? So it does take planning and it does take effort. And then you keep yourself from engaging in the things that we vow ourselves not to do anymore. So intoxication, illicit sex, meat eating and gambling, etc. It takes self-control. So the question then may be like, why do all these things, right? Well, this is what Krishna is saying. You do these things, you think of me, you fix your intelligence on me, which naturally will take you away from this intoxication, illicit sex, and so on. It's going to take you away from that because you're thinking of Krishna. If you do that, without a doubt, you're going to achieve your goal. And to me, that's very inspiring. That gives me a lot of hope that I can't do it because Krishna is there to help me. He says it's in my heart as Adi Yagya, which means it's very close to me and he knows my sincerity, and that there's no doubt I'm going to attain that. He highlights his loving nature.
Yeah, yeah, so nicely said. And I need that vote of confidence from Krishna because I have so many self-doubts about if I'm doing things right or um, how so not advanced I am a lot of times, and getting a little bit discouraged at times, but just always coming back to this idea of it's simple, just thinking of Krishna, servicing, dedicating my life to service, and then without doubt, I'll attain him.
Something about motivation, which is what you just spoke about right now, that connects to the point that I made about when God says there's no doubt, that means something, right? In terms of motivation, we suffer from forgetfulness. So we forget stuff very easily. Like we don't remember what we did last month. We don't remember our dear friends and all the beautiful things they've done for us. It kind of fades in time, and then yeah, that's my friend and I love them. But I'm not holding in my awareness all the different beautiful ways in which you've been there for me, you've been compassionate for me, all the gratitude that I should hold in my awareness is there, but it's not fully there because a lot of this stuff I forget. And similarly, and thankfully, all the wrong things that people do to us, we also forget, right? Like if you have significant others, like a spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend, and so on, you fight. 3 years later, you can ask yourself, what were we fighting again? Like 3 years ago, remember the big fight we had in this and that? Like, what was the reason? It's like, I don't know. Like we even forget what we were fighting about, right? So we are like this. We forget stuff. Just like when we say we're going to do stuff and we don't do. God, when he says there's no doubt, there's no doubt. And God doesn't forget. And he's also the best reciprocator. He reciprocates with us. So why am I saying this now within the context of motivation? If you chant 16 rounds purely, one time, Krishna doesn't forget that. And he's going to be there for you. All the little stuff you've done, all the devotional service we do, I've forgotten things that I've done for Krishna, but Krishna has not. And he's going to always remember that. And at the time of our death, he's certainly going to be there for us because he doesn't forget and he reciprocates perfectly, right? I was going to say better than everybody else, but that doesn't even capture. He perfectly reciprocates with everything we've done for him. So yes, it is in our best interest to always think of him because then there's more for him to reciprocate.
Yeah, so nicely said. Yeah, I think it's so easy to forget that God is God, all powerful, all knowing, all loving. And so that's a nice reminder. All right, well, thank you today. I really appreciate all of your knowledge of the Gita. You've been studying this for well over 10 years and leading us through this discussion. So it's not easy stuff. So
yeah, I would like to make the record straight here. It's not my knowledge. It's, if anything, is my ability to repeat what I've heard from Tukaram, and is also endless, right? It's like we were just discussing before we started. Yes, for over 10 years I've been studying this, and this time around when Tukaram gave us that story that connects all this terminology together, was as if I heard it for the first time. I was so happy to hear it. So yes, we do this, we like to listen to our teachers so we can hopefully repeat properly to others who are of interest as well. So it's my pleasure to do this with you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. It's just touching on the surface, there's so much to know, so many layers. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you again next week, hopefully. So, Haribol, thank you.
Haribol.